Hello and welcome to the podcast Sensory Success Stories, a podcast by the European Sensory Network, ESN. In it we will talk about recent trends, challenging questions and surprising results in the area of sensory and consumer science. I'm your host, Fabienne Hübener. The topic today is a taste of sustainability, the role of sensory and consumer research in the transition to more sustainable eating. And my guest is Michael Bom Frost, Associate Professor in Food Sensory Innovation at the University of Copenhagen. Hello, Bom. Welcome to the ESN podcast. Could you please introduce yourself?
My name is Michael Bom Frost. I'm an associate professor of, the official title is Food Sensory Innovation at the Department of Food Science at University of Copenhagen. I have a PhD in sensory science. I have worked a lot on dairy products in the early part of my career. And following that, I transitioned more into gastronomic research and research more on food and consumer acceptance of alternative foods and novel foods and beverages. So I've done work both on insects, beers, fermented beans, all different kinds of products that are at the forefront of what you can say the majority of people are eating right now.
We did a little pre-interview and you told me about a project, the EU-funded Smart Protein project, and I read a little bit in their latest publications. You mentioned the European meat consumers reported reducing their meat intake by 5%. And I was surprised to also read that 45% of Europeans identify as vegan, vegetarian, or flexitarian. So in your view, is that actually an encouraging process, or is that just a signal that the shift is going way too slow?
It's a little bit, is the glass half full or half empty in the case of this, because you can see there's progress, but it's also quite clear that the progress needs to happen quite fast for us to transition to a more sustainable food consumption pattern. There are challenges in the way that what people, you need to offer them a new, more desirable alternative. And I think that's the big challenge now, is that there's a lot of research trying to understand how can we make plant-based alternatives that are more interesting, more appealing to consumers and satisfy them in the longer run. And that's both for meat and for dairy replacement. So I think we're moving in the right direction. I think what I find particularly encouraging is that the amount of people who say that they are trying to reduce their meat consumption is increasing quite a lot. And I would also say that if you think about how slow changes in a population's diet is changing, we are probably going a little faster than we would normally do. But it would be nice if it would be advantageous for our climate emission goals if we transition away from meat and dairy even faster than we're doing now, or that we're reducing our meat and dairy consumption even more than we're doing now.
Mm-hmm. But I find it interesting that you say that it's actually probably going quicker than normally already, that we maybe overestimate how quickly people can change their nutrition.
If you think about food innovations, I read recently, I read a little piece saying that Heinz, they developed the baked beans in cans in the 1890s, so that's about 130 years ago, and they still make up around 10% of the total turnover of the whole conglomerate Heinz organization. So you can invent a product, and then still 130 years later, it is making up 10% of the total turnover of a company. Then you can get the indication of how slow it's actually going to us changing our food behavior. But of course, you can say there are other parts of our food behavior that is changing faster than the meat consumption. It could be the way we're delivering it, and I would say something like reducing the amount of meat in dishes, reducing the recommendation for how much meat we should eat, etc. So everything is pushing in the direction of saying it's a really good idea to reduce our meat consumption and our dairy consumption.
When you have been or followed the last couple of sensory science conferences, Pangborn or Eurosense, actually, as a scientist or visitor, you get the feeling a lot is happening. We have so many options. Then you wonder, why isn't it taking off quicker in the population? And you mentioned that there are two things. You can come up with new ideas, novelties, innovations, but
Yeah.
then people forget about researching consumer acceptance. So how crucial is it to study food acceptance alongside food innovations?
If you look at the many of the funding bodies at the EU level and national levels, you will see that they are concerned about two things. It's technological readiness level. How are we capable of producing some new products or using new technologies to reduce climate impact of our food production? And the second part is the societal readiness level. And in many cases, I think that the societal readiness level becomes sort of an ad lib, something that the technologically oriented products feel that projects feel that they need to do. They describe why it's necessary, but it's very difficult to find projects that have the societal readiness level, consumer acceptance of new technologies as the core of their understanding. And I think we've seen many cases over the years where we can say a technology has been invented, but in the end, it's rejected by the consumers because they have a fear of that there could be some adverse effects from using that technology in their food production. And food is really special in the way that we absorb it, we eat it, and it becomes part of us. So we're pretty much made up of everything that we ate. So, of course, people are more concerned about their food consumption than they are what digital devices they could use, because they don't become part of you in the same way.
I think you also did some research about vertical farming and how people see the products of vertical farming. What were your findings?
That's a recent study. It was out just a month ago or so, and there's been quite a lot of interest in vertical farms because you can say it's at a very abstract level, it's about land sparing. If we concentrate our production of food or plant plant-based foods on a smaller area, then we can free up more space for rewilding of nature, or for a more natural way of having the environment around us. And vertical farming is basically that you have indoor farming with artificial lighting and controlled conditions. So it means that you are producing it in a very artificial environment compared to just being in the field. And I think the promise is that you are not modifying the plants too much, and people can see the good reasons for why we need vertical farming. So it's a technology that, if you compare, some of my colleagues, they have compared a number of different technologies in different countries. How are they accepted? And it's something like modified atmosphere packaging, gene editing, all these kind of things. How are they accepted? And in that context, vertical farming is actually quite easily, or quite has a quite high consumer acceptance. And because of that, you can say it proves as a not proves, but it has potential to become part of the future landscape of food, because we can produce it with relatively high consumer acceptance. However, what we also know, just because if we are that as it is a new technology, consumers are still a little bit hesitant to accept it, and because of that, it's necessary to understand how they, when they just get the taste, the sensory input, um, what do they perceive it then? So the recent study that we published with Sarah Yeager was the first author of this, and in that study, initially in surveys, we asked people about their opinions, or she asked people about their opinions, and we could see that they still have a relatively low sensory expectations, that they will not like vertically farmed, vertically grown plants as much as they would if they had been grown in an organic production system. And with that, we tested. We had 190 consumers come in, and we tested a number of different herbs and leafy greens, and tested them blind, so people would only get the sensory information, and asked them how much do they like it and what kind of sensory properties do they perceive in them. And there you can see that the negative expectations were largely dissipating. People had they liked the vertically farmed um, plants and herbs as much as they liked the organically produced ones.
I have the feeling, at least in Germany, because maybe there's a very romantic idea how food has to be grown, and it should be in a beautiful
Yeah.
farm and harvested in full moon and stuff like that. I'm exaggerating, but I have the feeling in my circles or in Germany in general, vertical farmed foods has a hard standing here. People are reluctant to accept it. Do
Yeah.
you think that's different for different countries?
Germany was one of the test countries for the survey that was done, so they have lower expectations from the beginning. Yes, and because of that, of course, you're hesitant to try it the first time. But what I think is necessary for those that have vertical farms is to make sure that it becomes seen in the public, that they understand that it's there, and they get experiences with it, so that we can overcome the initial resistance towards trying this technology.
Mm.
There's a German company called Infarm. They have
Mm-hmm.
collaborated with different fast food options, fast food cafes, to produce leafy greens on the site. So when you're entering the fast food cafe, you can see the production taking place. So you get experience that it
Mm.
actually, oh, this is part of the food, and it's actually one of the huge advantages in my perception is that you can have a much shorter production chain. You don't need to move food, move the plants a lot, and thereby you can have added freshness, and that matters very much when we are in the domain of leafy greens.
Mm-hmm. Oh, interesting startup idea.
Yeah,
I think I would like to go into such a coffee or restaurant where I can see
yeah,
what will be on my plate before before it's cooked.
yes. We also had a supermarket chain here in Denmark where you could see they collaborated with the same German producer, and you could
Mm-hmm.
see it growing in the place. And of course, that will only be like a fraction of the total amount of leafy greens produced, but at least it was there. Some of it was delivered from a larger production site, but you were exposed to the technology and you got to learn it. There was more awareness creation around the technology.
This is one way to enhance acceptance in the population for eating more vegetables or plant based.
Yeah,
Other options are nudging or boosting. I'm sure you're familiar with these options.
yeah.
Do they do the trick? What do you think about them? Or what, in your mind, are the most promising approaches to enhance acceptance in the population?
Yeah, I think I remember listening to an interview with Daniel Kahneman where he said that he could see now that they probably oversold behavioral economics and nudging to change
Mm-hmm.
behavior. But I think it's also evident that if you do, there was a meta-analysis done, and this kind of low engagement tasks where you are doing the same again and again, if you tilt the decision board towards the more sustainable or healthy option, people will move in that direction. So you can see that it has an effect. But I think, and we've seen that in some recent experiments that we haven't reported yet, that you can only, if you push people too hard, they push back. They go the other
Mm-hmm.
way.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we have to. It's not enough to have people unconsciously moving in the right direction. They have to make they have to have an intention. They have to be willing to change before they are going further. It's a little bit of
Mm.
a zone of nearest development with Vygotsky thinking that okay, we can push people into the area of trying some plant-based foods. The next level is having them make it at home. It requires a lot more than it does to just nudge people to make a choice in a buffet, or to make a choice in a place where it's not themselves making the food, right?
Mhm. And you also looked into how actually social media can influence your food choice and maybe affects your decision to eat more plant-based. Could you give a brief overview of the study?
Yeah, that's also a very recent publication from led by our collaborators in the Smart Protein at the University of Ghent, where the first author, Listia Rini, she published, or we published a paper just 2 3 weeks ago. And this was like a survey, so looking into how do people use social media, and can say that there's a substantial fraction of people who trust and use social media to find information about plant-based food. So you can say in it's an important channel for communicating the advantages that there is, and it can reinforce, and it can speed up the change to plant-based meat alternatives at the EU level. You can say we can use the social media to convey the message, to explain why we should trust different plant-based alternatives, and how they're made, and use it to change the behavioral intentions of the consumer. And of course, this is a social media is not something you control from a central point of view, but there's a uh, whole jungle of influencers that are helping in different directions. And of course, there needs to be some sort of regulation and understanding of how the information that they provide and they give, that it's valid, and that it's in the best interest of the society as well. Yeah.
That's actually a pretty positive outlook on social media. When I sometimes see on social media some arguments about, yeah, we should eat less meat or whatever, or just a link to a Guardian article that also says go plant based, and then there are 1,000 comments of people that just seem to hate this idea and say, I will eat 3 steaks just because I read your post today about that we should go more plant based. So there seems to be an incredible heated and polarized discussion on social media when it comes to meat.
But I think that's one of the principles of social media, is that their advantage is that people are engaged, and it can be a positive engagement, and it can be a negative engagement. So this is the place where we will see the polarization, and it's a lot easier to polarize behind when there are screens in between you than if it's just face to face, right? You wouldn't see the
Mhm.
same type of behavior in real life. And I think what we've seen in different surveys is also that people don't choose the food they choose because they are worried of other people's acceptance of that food. I mean, that's very low on the priority. It's taste and it's health that are high on the priority,
Mhm.
the considerations when we are deciding what to eat. It's not what other people think of us. So I think it's quite important that we focus on the taste, and that we focus on making people understand the sustainability aspects and the health aspects of the food that we eat.
Mhm. That's actually good news that taste and health play such an important role. And there are actually more good news. And I read that the plant based food sales in Europe grew by 21% between 2020 and 2022.
Yeah.
And especially the Danish consumers are very high on plant based consumption. And especially plant based milk is important for them. So, why are Danish consumers more receptive to plant-based options? Why are you trailblazers in Europe?
Well, there are probably a number of reasons, and I don't think I can prioritize them and say this is the most important, and so on. But certainly the very high environmental concern of the consumer is a prerequisite for choosing this. And I think if you just look at organic versus conventional consumption, if we take organic food, the Danish consumers already have the world's highest in the westernized world, and in the places where we use labels to indicate that something is made in an organic production system, we already have the highest consumption of that. So, and a lot of that has to do with environmental concern. So it's not a big step to move from I eat organic to I would like to have a higher amount of plant-based foods in my diet. So I think that's one of them. And I think also you can say some of the companies that are in Denmark have they they've worked well for this. If you take a company like Naturally, it actually founded in 1988. So initially it was made for people who were lactose intolerant and or could not tolerate milk. The first products that they had on the market, and it's sort of the same story like Oatly in Sweden, is that you have something that's for a niche, but by providing the benefits that it's actually both tasty and the more it's not something in the taste, but that you know that this is more sustainable. When people are concerned about the future of our planet, then it's easier to say if you live up to the taste, it's easier to make the shift because you're not changing much of your behavior. You're still eating your oatmeals, pouring a, a plant-based liquid over instead of a cow-based liquid over it, and so it's a minimal disruption of your consumption pattern. It doesn't take a big effort to change. And I think that's what makes it easier for people to start with the plant-based milk and say, yes, instead of animal-based, cow-based milk, I'm going to switch to plant-based dairy alternatives. And of course, they taste a little bit different, but when people have been exposed to it for a while, they like it better. And we know what we like what's familiar, and when they become more familiar, we like them better.
And for the rest of Europe, there's still more steps to take. And you also did one study that involved virtual reality to make people more interested in eating plant-based food.
Yeah.
How did you do that?
Yeah, this is a study that is out now. It's together. It's a collaboration. It's inside a project called Plant Pro, which is funded by the Danish Innovation Foundation, and it's a collaboration. There are 3 universities and 17 companies there. And the particular experiment that we planned here was a collaboration with the psychologists here at University of Copenhagen. So it's headed by a postdoc called Adela Plecata, and also another psychologist, Guido Makransky, is a co-author of this, and they were the specialists on virtual reality. So we needed them in order to carry out the study. And I think what really is the advantage of this is that we were trying to double check the choices that happen in virtual reality with what people would do in reality. And if I walk you through it, it was like a
Hmm.
two-stage process. So people would have an experience of the future in virtual reality. And the control for that is that they would be told this experience by a narrator, an avatar in virtual reality, giving the same information instead of showing the outcome. So the outcome was you're taking to the future 30 years ahead in time, and you will see the consequences of our food consumption pattern. And the scenery was a national park, and you could see how increased droughts, more intense wildfires, and more frequent pests attack, etc. How that all would affect the natural park and how it would destroy the pristine nature. And then following that, they would make a food choice in virtual reality between more or less meat, high beef, 50% beef, and 0% beef, where the 0% it was an alternative, a plant-based alternative to meat. And what we measured there, we asked them to which one would you like to choose, and when they've experienced the future in virtual reality versus being told it, they were more likely to choose the plant-based versions. When we also measured, there was an expected liking. And I think what the really good part of this experiment was that we then transferred them. We had the virtual reality dining situation that we had made was an actual virtual copy of our test facility here in Copenhagen.
Mm-hmm.
So they left the virtual reality, they walked out of a room and they walked into another room, and the new room that they're in was exactly the same as the one they just left virtually. And then we asked them to redo the same food choice again. Now they had access to the full sensory stimuli. They could approach the dishes, they could smell them, and they could see them more clearly than you can in virtual reality. And they were rating expected liking, and then they had to choose the dishes. The challenge is also that when you move from a virtual reality to an actual reality, and we could see that we didn't have a difference in how many people chose the reduced meat or the no meat versions. However, what we could see, if we count the amount of grams of beef that was consumed, that still, even though you didn't change away from meat, those who chose meat, they reduced the amount of meat they eat. So there was still was a
Mm-hmm.
difference in the beef consumption. So I think the main learning from this is that you have to use an effort to make them emotionally engaged in the topic. It's not just information, it's also about experience that and having an emotional response to that.
Fascinating study, I have to say. It also shows how small the steps are. I mean, it's pretty impressive to see in the future, to see what happens in 30 years, and that depends on also your consumption. But that makes just a little change in your behavior. But luckily, I think that would theoretically be a lot when a lot of people would follow up on that.
It has to be about self-efficacy, that you feel you can do something, but you don't feel that you're pushed to do it. And I think it's for many people it becomes like there's a pivotal changing point. They realize something and they go towards a more sustainable food consumption pattern. And when you start on that journey, it's difficult to go back and just forget about it. So it's like when once you've seen the effects, it's difficult to
Mm.
unsee what the consequences of our food consumption system is. And of course, also been on this journey. I mean, I've been a normal Danish consumer when it comes to meat consumption, not until long ago. And I think, I mean, I'm a full blown flexitarian now. I eat very little meat, and I know for sure that I eat below the recommendations in terms of how much meat we should consume. The new Danish dietary recommendations is that we shouldn't have more than 50 grams of red per day. So there's and I also have a lot of faith in the young people, even though last week there was a report in Denmark saying that among the young people, the increase in climate action in relation to their food consumption isn't going up as much. So I think we've maybe for the young people we've reached like a plateau, but it also means that we have to offer, if you take the perspective from the food industry, we have to offer the alternatives that change more people's behavior. And some of them we have in Denmark, we have a national advisory body for it's called the Climate Council, and they advise, they when it's about our food consumption, say we really have to normalize not eating meat. It has to be normal to say I don't eat meat, or to say for this meal I don't eat meat. And I think we don't need, from official side, and from, I think what I work towards is not to say that everyone should go vegan. It is to say we really need to be within just the dietary guidelines. If we get our populations to eat the amount of meat, not eat more than what is recommended, then we can reduce our climate impact substantially.
And I think also the producers and the industry plays a role in that, in offering tasty alternatives, especially maybe for people who don't want to leave out meat. Maybe they're used to their schnitzel. And when they see, okay, I have a handful of options and actually they taste okay, then that
Yeah.
will make this transition easier. And I love to try out everything that's new on the market. I would say 8 out of 10 products I find really untasty. I don't like it. But there are some who I find this is tastier than I remember meat. But what I can't find is actually alternatives, at least here in Germany, for yogurt, for especially cheese. So why is it so much harder to find dairy alternatives than meat
I
alternatives?
think you should separate a lot between, you can say, the plant based milks and the plant-based milk alternatives, as the dairy industry prefers that it's called, and cheese alternatives, plant-based cheese alternatives. And for the plant-based milk alternatives, we are very much in the direction of that. The consumers that try it and use it, they're pretty happy with it. Whereas if we go into the plant-based cheese alternatives, then the consumers' experience of what is in the market is very low sensory quality, or that they don't like it. It's very different from the cheese that they know. But I think it's really difficult to have alternatives that are targeted to be exactly like the products that they replace. I've enjoyed the perspective of saying, well, it has to have the same function. It doesn't have to taste exactly the same, but if you can use this ingredient, or you can use this delicate or piece of plant-based cheese alternative instead, and you experience that it's that you like it, then it's good enough. But I think it's a difficult pathway to say we would like to one-on-one replace exactly what the alternative intends to replace. We would like to have exactly the same sensory property. That's very, very difficult, and I think we would have to accept. I mean, if you can make it quite okay in similarity, so that people don't get too shocked about it, that how different it is, then it's good enough, as long as it also tastes good. And I think that's one of the challenges with some of the plant-based products, is that from pulses there are some off flavors and other things that people object to, and that's of course a challenge that needs to be solved, either by growing pulses that have less of this, or by using technology to get rid of some of the beaniness that is disliked.
And why not just forget about all these replacements, meat replacements, dairy replacement, and eat like many people in the world do, just maybe lentils, eat vegetarian, use a lot of different recipes for vegetable dishes. Why does that seem to be difficult?
In the recent survey that we did, and that ProVeg made a seminar about a webinar about, and from Smart Protein, we could see that the southern European countries are also using pulses a lot more than the northern European countries. And I would say 2016 was FAO announced it to be the International Year of Pulses, and they made an international cookbook where pulses recipes with pulses from all over the world was in, and there was none from Denmark. There was not even one recipe in it, and it was very disappointing. And I would say, if we go back in history to 150 years ago, before we really changed from into an animal-based agriculture here in Denmark, of course people were eating more pulses, and of course pulses, peas and beans were a large part of the daily food consumption. It was a large part of the dietary intake. We forgot about this in the modernization, and it's not that we have to come up with something completely new to go back to this. It's that we have to look at our history and look at the traditions and figure out what were actually the really tasty recipes. And I think now we are in a much more globalized world, so it's also about looking out into the world and finding the cuisines that have a really good use of pulses, lentils, peas, and beans in their cuisine, both as a raw ingredient but also transformed in one way or another in different ways. And I think this has a lot of promise, in the aspect that even though it's relatively new, it's a tested technology. It's well known that pulses do this, and you need to learn how to cook them, but there's not like a fear of a new technology involved in this. So I think that's one of the advantages. But it's a huge challenge. We looked at it. The Danish dietary recommendations, they changed 2 years ago, and in those recommendations, it said now that we have to eat 100 grams of pulses per day. And this is the first time that pulses have been singled out as a food group in itself. And the current, so the surveys that have been made since then, looking into the Danish dietary patterns, says that we eat about, on average, the Danish eat 3 to 5 grams of pulses per day. So we have to like multiply this by 30, 20 to 30 times before we get to the point of eating that much. But I think it's a much more positive way of thinking of how to change your food pattern to go towards something, to say, okay, I just want to increase my pulses consumption and I want to find good ways of doing that, either in classical recipes or by using the world cuisine, etc., compared to saying, okay, we have to come up with a new technology, and first we have to convince people that this technology is safe and that it doesn't unnecessarily destroy the food that we would like to consume. That's as big a challenge as it is to say, just eat more pulses and make them available. And I think that you can see in Denmark there's a whole movement for this reintroduction from an agricultural point of view. The use of pulses also makes sense because they sequester nitrogen and they put nitrogen into the soil, so you need less fertilizer. And that's one of the big challenges too, is that our dependency on fertilizers for a high yield can be uh, dampened by having a crop rotation system where pulses are involved. So it can become much more normal. But I would say when we hear from the farmers in Denmark, they're scared to start it because they don't know if they can sell it, if they can sell the pulses that they're making. But it's growing. It's like there's an undergrowth
Mhm.
of new interesting pulses being produced in Denmark. Lentils, peas, chickpeas, different beans, even fava beans, etc. And there's a huge interest in it. But I think we
Mhm.
don't have a we don't have a stressed out and connected chain from the agricultural system to the consumers, that all of them are working together to increase the consumption, and we need that in order to do that.
Mhm. Mhm. That brings us back to the beans from Heinz, you know, which are, yeah, I like them. They're very tasty in a taco or something, easy
Yep.
to make. And
Then
I also just saw a post by Jessica
yeah,
Aschemann Witzel. There's a magazine out called Green Transition by the Royal Danish Academy of
yeah,
Science and Letters, and she just has like 4 points how to, I would call it, how to spice up your food when you are missing maybe the meat. And one thing I really like is
yeah.
umamify your vegetables. I just thought about it, and I did that exactly yesterday. I cooked very boring leek, and I was unhappy with what I had. And then I thought, come on, take the soy sauce, umamify your food. And it was so delicious. So I think there are also a couple of options for people to come up with recipes by themselves, to get creative with the veggies that they have in
Mm,
front of them. And umamifying was one option. The other one was include marine biomass. I mean, use seagrass
yeah,
or something like that. I mean, that's still a little bit
yeah,
foreign, but yeah, it sounds interesting. Then, of course, diversify your food sources. Maybe, include something that you usually don't use or that is local. Right now, I have a phase where I get local food, which here in Germany in the winter is basically cabbage. So I have cabbage every day. But yeah,
yeah.
umamify it. That works. And then the other option that she says is pick up or re-upscale innovations that have evolved in nature or in culinary traditions, for
Yeah.
example, fermentation. So I think this is also could be part of a education of the population, how you can,
Mm, yeah.
yeah, how can you make your cooking and your food more interesting and not miss meat and cheese so much.
Yeah. I think Jessica Asherman-Mitchell, she's very good at promoting these things, and she's been working for a long time in the green transition and scaling up the a food consumption pattern that is more sustainable. She's also the project leader for the Plant Pro project that I referred to here, where we do
Mm-hmm.
some of the research. And I think the idea that to umamify, if we go back and look at, I think that's what to next year is the 20th anniversary of the new Nordic food declaration that was made by 10 chefs, and they were talking about purity and the pristine landscapes of the Nordic and so on. That, but also that food had to be simple, and I think that has been something that has added to it. And in the beginning, the realization was that if you did that, when you work towards this, you were missing the umami, and this has caught up in using fermentation. And I think, I was director for Nordic Food Lab for a period from 2012 until it closed in 2018. And one of the things that we worked on would be fermented plant-based foods. I was very
Mm-hmm.
happy to see in the recent results, for instance, in this pan-European survey that we did in Smart Protein, that the knowledge about tempeh, which is a fermented pulse-based food originally from Indonesia, but that has been introduced in Denmark by fermenters and by people who are saying we really need to change away from meat, and this is a, a low-tech alternative that's not the same as meat, but try it. And if we compare the knowledge of tempeh in Denmark to, for instance, Southern Europe, I mean, the knowledge level is a lot. The people, they know what tempeh is to a much higher degree than they do in other countries, and I think that comes from this idea of that we need to ferment plant-based raw materials to umamify it, and in both in Nordic Food Lab, but also in Smag for Livet, and my um, Professor Ole Mortensen, who was leading Smag for Livet, which is was a large research and dissemination project that lasted for 7 years, has been very keen on using this umamification as a step. So you can say uh, one thing is fermenting, another thing is making sure that if you're going to use meat or marine biosources, as you say here, that it's something that adds the umami, that it gives extra umami to the food that we're using, that it's not just for the protein, but it's also for the taste. So we don't have to go all meatless, but we should use meat responsibly, and for the type of in the cases where it adds umami, we can use that, or we can use plant-based, often fermented alternatives.
You just mentioned the food lab. I also remembered the ESN meeting we had in Copenhagen, and how involved you and the whole university and department is in encouraging students to, do their own startups with food, come up with new ideas. You really help them in this transition, not just to be a researcher or a worker in the industry, but as a sensory researcher, maybe become an entrepreneur. So, in your mind, in your opinion, what do you see maybe in Denmark or globally as a really promising startup that would help with the food transition?
Let me use umamification as an example, because it's not just about scaling up, that there's one company or a few companies that um, grow a lot, but it's also a question of scaling out, that when we have to diversify our food sources, there will be someone who are better at tempeh, there'll be someone who are better at making tofu, there'll be someone who are better at making novel plant-based alternatives based on fractioning the plant-based ingredients, etc. So it's about diversifying and scaling out. So I don't think I want to mention one in particular, but if I have to mention one in particular, I would like to take a company that's called Agrain, and they use a side stream, and they're also a partner in the Plant Pro project. They use a side stream from beer brewing. Brewers spent grain, what's left over after you removed all the starch. You have the hull of the malt, and they take that, they dry it, and they make it into a flour. If you look at that as a side stream globally, it has a huge
Mhm.
potential, because so much beer is produced globally that you can really cover a substantial amount of the energy requirements, nutritional requirements, by upcycling this ingredient in particular. And it doesn't mean that it has to be a grain that does it alone. There are other companies elsewhere that are trying to use this particular ingredient.
But to do what? In what kind of product do they use it?
It becomes a flour that you can use as you would use a flour normally, but if you use it alone, it's not a good bread. But you can replace, let's say, maybe 10% in up to 10%. That's what they state on their website, with the brewer's spent grain flour, their grain flour in some applications. And I think what a grain has done differently from others is to think, we have to remember, where does this brewer's spent grain come from? What kind of malt is it? What are the special sensory properties that, by looking at the input ingredient, it's not just a huge homogeneous mass, but we have to fractionate. So there'll be some of it, maybe it comes from a darker beer, and they will be suitable for some applications, and from a pilsner, from a lighter beer, it would be suitable for other applications, right? So that you have to consider how the particular ingredient that you're upscaling, and how the diversity in that ingredient can be used to make it useful for different applications.
I like that idea. They call it the spent grain. I just racked my brain. What would I call it in German? Maische, mash. And they can turn it into crackers, into flour, and they have interesting recipes on their website: pancakes and campfire bread, chocolate brownie. I will try it out when I can get it here. Maybe it's not yet ready for global shipping. There are two trends in the sensory and consumer science area that we hear all the time about: in vitro meat, and then also food produced in tanks by bacteria. What do you think about these two trends?
In vitro meat, or in vitro all types of precision fermentation of plant-based alternatives to meat and dairy. I can see the attraction. There's a parallel that I would like to think that it's a pathway that we go towards, that hopefully we can have a food production system where it means that because the demand for animal-based product is lower, we can have a higher animal welfare for the products that are used. And I think that the in vitro meat and dairy production is a way of saying we can produce it without low animal welfare. And I think that will appeal to a lot of people. And a lot of people will say, if it's sufficiently close to what I like, I'm going to try it.
Have you ever tried it? Clean meat or in vitro meat?
Yeah, I have.
You did. I think you're the first person, because I know it's very, very expensive.
In the startup environments that I've been in, I've seen, I've visited places like this, and I've tasted it. But right now, I mean, Singapore has approved, you can sell in vitro, or what is it called, lab grown chicken, in restaurants and in retail now. And I'm sure that, I mean, the legislation in EU is a little bit slower than it is in some of these other places. So in the end, probably it will be allowed. It took quite a long time for the European Union to accept that we should have insects for human consumption. We're a little bit more hesitant when it comes to this. And of course, you can see Italian legislators saying that they are directly against lab-grown meat. They would like to have it banned and so on in Italy. So there's a lot of not only feelings, but also industrial interest at stake for this. And I'm sure that there will be challenges for it to scale, both in terms of production, but also in terms of consumer acceptance. But I hope that it can be a solution. That I like the parallel that I think of is, at one point, when you wanted to listen to music, you had to play it yourself. And at that time, Steinway, they produced a massive amount of not very high quality pianos for the American market, because that's where they were, and people were buying them. And they were producing, at their peak, they were producing 4 million Steinway pianos a year. And then came the gramophone, and people were playing records. So instead of performing the music themselves, they switched to to listening to someone else's performance. And I think it led to that, of course, the Steinway industry or the Steinway piano production completely folded and became very small, but they survived by making high quality. So I would
Mm.
hope that if we can have this same sort of pattern, is that we will have animal production still, but it will be of higher animal welfare quality, and it will be of higher sensory quality compared to what it is now, because we have an alternative that can serve the need of producing a massive amount of a very nutritious food, but do it without the same level of animal suffering that is in the current production system.
And how did you like the in vitro meat when you tasted it?
The first in vitro meat tasting was done in 2013, live on an English channel. I believe it was BBC, and the company or the researcher behind Mark Post from Netherlands, they carefully crafted three burgers, and they had some experts coming in tasting a burger that was made this way and saying it tastes pretty much like meat. And of course it does, because it's the same cells. And I think it's a lot easier to make that. And if you combine it with 3D printing and you weave in the right type of fat and so on, then you can really make something that is close to a marbled piece of beef or something in that category. So it's not it's for that, it's not going to be about can they perform, can they make something that tastes good. I think they can, but it's about the other advantages. Will people accept this production form, and will they see the advantage that actually we're saving a lot of animal lives by doing it this way instead.
Mhm. Just maybe one sentence on this idea of producing food that is comes from bacteria in big tanks, and they just produce the micro and macronutrients we need and turn that into some novel food. What do you think about that one?
Yeah. Oh, I think even though it's food culture is unevenly distributed, and there's also some people saying that the future is here already, it's just unevenly distributed. I think that the particularity about consuming food is that you consume it, you put it into your body. So that you have to provide pleasure, you have to provide something that speaks to you, both as that it tastes good, that it's good for your health, uh, shorter and long term, and that there's some reflective, that there's some ideas about the food that you like better. And I don't mind personally that some of the food is made this way, but I think that the average consumer will find themselves in Blade Runner 2049, where they are eating some sort of goo that has a hologram put on
Mhm.
top of it, and feeling that this is not tasty, this is not really good. But I hope that food culture is so strong that people will say, oh, there's something about growing your own vegetables. There's something about pickling your own greens and so on that makes it interesting.
So my last question, we have already spent over an hour. And from your perspective, within the area of sensory and consumer science, what do you think needs more attention, also more money, more effort to promote the transition to more sustainable food?
I think that there are some of the climate warriors that say that there are many solutions that already exist. That we have to, it would probably be easier to scale them than to come up with very new novel technologies. And I think particularly in consumption of food,
Hmm.
the idea of that this is something you're eating advocates that we should look to tradition, we should look to what do we have in the larder, what do we have in our cultural sphere that we can use more of to make our food consumption pattern more sustainable. So the idea of how can we revitalize and commercially reinvigorate traditional foods is a topic that I find really appealing, and I think the challenge is to do it without brutally destroying the traditions. So, for instance, some research that I did with a very good student from a PhD student from Indonesia, Dwi Fibri, we looked at the Indonesian consumers' attitudes towards traditional Indonesian foods and their modernized versions of them. And what we could see is that if a food item had been modernized a long time ago, like ketchup manis, people believe that the industrialized version was the one. It was the one they knew and they liked it better. And I really fear that if we modernize too brutally, we lose all the nuances that were in the diversity of food. And I think if we are going to, the best strategy towards having a bland globalized food is to make sure that the local traditions are revitalized and they are brought up to 21st century.
Mm-hmm. In my case, when I think about what my grandmother cooked, I would eat potatoes every day. There was not a very sophisticated culinary tradition, but I'm sure, yeah, you can pick up traditions from many areas. Also, I mean, we one time I remember had a meeting about sorghum. Riette Kok from South Africa, she introduced the cookies that they made, and this is very traditional grain in Africa, and it grows in harsh conditions. And so this is a tradition from Africa, but it could also bring us some new ideas. So just not look on your own traditions, but also on the traditions around the world.
Yep, exactly.
I know we still have a couple of questions open, but I know also the time is running. Is there anything else that for you is important, maybe that we haven't mentioned yet in the area of how sensory can help in the transition to more sustainable food?
I think what occupies my mind now is how do consumers make a trade-off between taste and their own personal health and the planetary health. And I would like to say it this way. I mean, it's clear, and everyone who talks about a sustainable food transition, they say that we either cook more plants or we cook the planet. So we have to make sure that it's attractive and that it's funded and it becomes a strategic research goal to increase plant-based food consumption. I mean, in Denmark, we've had a plant-based, it's called Plantefonden in Danish, a plant-based research goal of saying within the coming 7 years, we will use 1 billion Danish kroner, around 140 million euro to fund transition towards eating more plant-based food. And Plantebranchen, which is one of the actors that were involved in lobbying for this, one of the basic lines is that we are not asking for special treatment. We just don't want to be treated worse than those that are producing animal-based food when it comes. And I mean, that's for the Danish food landscape. But I think we can easily scale that up to a European level and say, compare how much funding is going into continuing developing the dairy and meat industry compared to how much money goes into continue developing the plant-based alternatives and plant-based food in general. It would be nice if they were comparative and it wouldn't be like 8 or 10 times more to them. We're short of time here now. We have to do it fast. We need more funding to do that.
Bom, thank you very much for your time, and see you in Barcelona.
Looking forward to that.
Thank you for listening. This podcast was brought to you by the European Sensory Network in 2023. The intro music was by Jackie Brown and is licensed under the Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License, and you can listen to more of his music on freemusicarchive.org.